Hello and welcome to Black Bear Atheist. This is part 5 of watching Cliff video. Can good and evil be based on evolution? You don't need to watch it in order, it's different questions, so different reaction. Let's get into it.
Paul wrote a lot of the books of the Bible and stuff, and we trust him and we trust his word. Why do we trust him and not I don't know, I'm thinking of Joseph Smith, who started Mormonism or whatever, and he said he had a revelation from God and started a book and all that stuff. So why do we trust Paul but we don't trust him?
The reason that I trust Paul to give me accurate information is because the eyewitness community who knew Christ accepted his writings as legitimate. See, so much for me comes back to who's reliable.
How will you know that? How will you know the eyewitness accept Paul when the only actual written books that we know who wrote them were Paul's? Every other one were anonymous.
And the bottom line for me is the evidence, historical in nature, of the way he lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead is Jesus is reliable. Now, the way I find out about Jesus is from the eyewitnesses who saw him, who heard him. They wrote what they saw and they heard. Their writings were accepted as legitimate, historically reliable. The Gnostic Gospels were not accepted as historically reliable. And
why did he make it sound like they were actually writing it as it was happening? They wrote it down decades later. That is not reliable. Eyewitness itself is unreliable. Now, if you're saying that they write it down decades later, that's not even to be considered. It's like calling someone to the court of law and then having them recall their memory from 40 years ago. Again, you have garbage.
They were not written until the 2nd century. They were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel of Thomas was not written by Thomas. Good gracious, it's probably not written until 120, 130, 140. Thomas was not around at that point. He was dead. So his name is attached to a fake gospel that is not historically accurate. The early church knew that, and they rejected it as, no, not reliable. So the reason I accept Paul's writings is because the eyewitnesses of Christ, who knew Christ, who put their faith in him, accepted Paul's writings as legit. Stuart, what about you? Why do you?
Who are those? You see, it did not present any of that. It just said the people. Which people? The church leaders? Because they were not eyewitnesses.
Historicity of it too. Joseph Smith, look at his life and look at, for example, the history of what happened in upstate New York.
I just love the transition. I'm sorry, I have to give it to them. The transition between those two duos is just flawless. It's like it's like he had them practicing from birth for this legendary transition. It was like, Stuart, take it over. And then it just smoothly came in. This is amazing. Like, the duel is very interesting. They're speaking gibberish, obviously. But the duel is very, very, they're connected. It's like they have that chemistry. Anyways, moving on.
Where a lot of Mormonism got off the ground. Look at the plates created, these golden plates, the magical underwear. I mean, I could have created plates in my garage, right? Spray painted them. What Jesus pulled off and what Paul started teaching from Jesus is obviously the eyewitness piece and talking to other eyewitnesses that took over thousands based off of the early church and what they encountered that took over the Roman Empire. That is way stronger historically than if you look into Mormonism and what happened in upstate New York. Secondly, archaeologically speaking, those sites in upstate New York are fantasy. Many of them haven't even existed. Archaeologically, what you have there in the New Testament and where Paul is specifically, you have over 84, it's around 84 different facts historically of places that existed just within the book of Acts alone. So you have places like
That doesn't make it true. Again, let's go back to my Harry Potter claim. There are places in Harry Potter that actually do exist. Does that mean Harry Potter exists? No. And someone put in the comments of that last video saying, in the video that I did that I named Harry Potter exists, it says something along the line that I haven't proven. I don't need to. It's already proven. It's in your heart. Harry Potter exists whether you like it or not. And he's a god.
Towns like Bethany. Galilee, I believe, was known, but you have Bethesda. These are towns that have historically been shown now to exist. It was only out of the Pauline letters, for example, and the Gospels that have shown these towns actually exist. No other ancient document has shown that so many of these different towns actually exist. So archaeologically, the difference is so grand, it's scary. So archaeologically and historically,
I don't believe that at all. And even if that's the case, we could still find evidence of towns that were destroyed way after, before Jesus even came to be. So it's not a problem to find the towns without relying on your very, very good, reliable Bible.
historical verifiability. Next would be, who is Paul? Who is Joseph Smith? The character. Joseph Smith, talk about the amount of women he slept with. Talk about the sexism that went on, that goes on, sadly, in Mormonism today. It's only men can own their own planet. It's definitely not women. What did Paul teach? What was his character? Specifically, though, when he got knocked off that horse and his encounter with Christ, historically, in the Gospels and outside of the Gospels, arguably he was going to be the most well-known rabbi in history, especially at that time, and yet he switches and becomes a Christian because of this encounter. And you have James, the half-brother.
Why don't you tell us what was Paul doing before he fell off the horse? Killing Christians? Is that not important to mention? Couldn't we just say the same person that made Mormonism, the founder, was also just doing the same? It was just doing sin and then all of a sudden God encountered him. Couldn't you just use the same storyline? Which he basically did. And sexism in Mormonism? Why do people do this? There's sexism in Christianity too. And Paul clearly said no woman should be teaching in the church. And a lot of people still believes that. Sexism? You want to be pointing fingers and talking about sexism? Okay.
Brother of Jesus as well. So he was the head of the Sanhedrin at one point. And what happens? These radical life changes where they go from Jews, who were more so Pharisees and heads of the Sanhedrin and huge synagogues and had all this influence, to all of a sudden saying, you know what? I peed in the same toilet growing up as my half-brother, and I made fun of him all the time, and we get his family even made fun of him in his claims all the time, and then all of a sudden, I'm going to die for believing that my brother rose from the dead. And Paul.
Also, how will you be laughing at your brother when he's performing miracles? Does that make any sense? It's like you could flip this, agree with the claims, it doesn't make sense. Disagree with the claim, none of it makes sense. You have a person that's doing a bunch of miracles and nobody knew about him, nobody read about him in his lifetime. His brother did not believe that he was even doing miracles. Isn't that very concerning? And this is supposed to be the person that saves the entire planet. And he went into the middle of nowhere.
Paul very similarly, right? He gave up everything. He was considered a complete joke. He went from the top of the world in Jewish rabbinical studies, right, and leadership, to literally dirt.
That is not really special. It wasn't like the Jews were like Romans, or really any empire that actually did something. like being on top of the Jews is really not that much of a special thing because they were already conquered by someone else.
For what he said he encountered with the resurrected Christ. Totally different from Joseph Smith. Great question.
No, it's not. Terrible answer. It's basically the same thing. I was once a sinner, now I'm saved. Joseph Smith. I was once a bozo, now I found a new religion. And I make a lot of money from it. And I could actually put my sexist thoughts into it. The Bible is not any different. You can read it for yourself. Find the verses where Paul clearly says, no woman shall be teaching in churches. Anyways, I think that's the question for today. If you liked the video, like and subscribe. Have a lovely day.